International Jazz Day. My name is Mathe. I'm the editor of Jazz Life magazine. Today, we've got a very interesting and very important topic, I guess. It's on the life and career of Todd Matshikiza. My panelists are as follows. I've got Dr. Sazi Dlamini from UKZN, a lecturer and a musician. I've got Nomfundo Xaluva, an artist and a lecturer from UCT. And I've got Dr. Carol Muller from the University of Pennsylvania in the United States, as well as Dr. Lindelwa Dalamba from VET, a lecturer as well. Welcome, everybody. Before we discuss our topic, I'd also like to acknowledge the following institutions for having made this possible. I'll start with the University of KwaZulu-Natal, the Center for Creative Arts, as well as the University of Johannesburg and Arts and Culture, the University of KZN, Center for Jazz and Popular Music, and South African Association of Jazz Educators. Thank you very much again for coming. I'm so excited about this topic. We're talking about that just before we went on air. Todd Matshikiza, the life and career. Who was Todd Matshikiza, and what really made him such a remarkable person? I will start with Nomfundo. Are you able to share with us your general impressions of the man and his music and his times, just briefly?
Good afternoon to everybody, and what a pleasure it is to be here. I think I must concede, that I don't know actually whether I know enough to really delve into who the man was, but I think my interest in taking part this afternoon is to really get an understanding from my fellow panelists, in terms of where Todd Matshikiza is positioned in the history of South African music, South African jazz, choral music, journalism, and I think because my area of study, having been Miriam Makeba and the women of that time, Todd Matshikiza is this prolific sort of composer and contributor who always comes up in text, it always comes up in reference. So I can never really read something on South African jazz, particularly of the 1950s, and not, come across the work and the life of Todd Matshikiza. But I think also, it's one of those where I think his legacy and his work and who he was is it's very multi-layered, and I'm quite interested to hear, what everybody else has to say. But I've got my thoughts on it, which I'll share as the conversation progresses. Okay, thank you very much. And let me apologize to the viewers for just having a voice. I wish I was also live there, but due to technical problems, it wasn't possible. Let me go to Dr. Carol Muller, your impressions of our subject today.
Hi, everyone. It is really wonderful to be here from Philadelphia. Yeah, we are moving into the spring and summer. It's still a little chilly, and it is 7 a.m. for me. So it's really wonderful. And I'm a little bit like Nomfundo. I've done a lot of thinking about a lot of things, but actually Todd Matshikiza is something of an anomaly to me because I just don't know. I feel like even when we think about the writing about King Kong, it's so much from a white perspective that what I find myself looking for is kind of what is his story, and there is a kind of silencing in an amazingly productive life. I've actually just loved going along a lot of different pathways as I've prepared for this to kind of figure out who he really was, because we know King Kong was so important, but there was so much more, and his music is so varied. I just think that this is a really wonderful moment for us to have this conversation. and for all of us, it may be to expand our thinking about his contribution. I think we're going to honor this man in a way that maybe hasn't been sufficiently honored, maybe in the history of jazz and the history of theater and the history of choral music. I mean, I think there are a lot of questions we have to address. So
no, that's true. That's true. I agree with you, Dr. Carol Muller. Dr. Sazi Dlamini, your impressions, sir?
I would echo my colleagues in many ways that it's a privilege to be part of this kind of focus on the late Todd Matshikiza for all the facets that he exposes.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of activities and the things that he did, also, especially as they touch music, you know, in that he shows pretty much the challenges and what is possible, what relates to what we got to introduce to him as a musician, but look at what he's touched and what he's involved with. I think it's a great subject to focus on, with whom not only we will know him, we probably will know ourselves if we look closely and listen.
Closely, yeah, and deeper. Oh, that's great. No, I agree with you 100% there. Dr. Lindelwa Dalamba?
Hi, thank you so much. I think it's been a long and problematic road that got us to talk about Todd Matshikiza in a jazz forum. I think for too long, Todd Matshikiza has been honored more in theater, in the development of theater, pre-Gibson Kente. I think for too long, Todd Matshikiza has been honored in the writings of the drum generation. I think for too long, Todd Matshikiza has only been acknowledged as part of the great exodus into exile after the raising of Sophiatown into the 1960s. I think this panel gives us an opportunity to talk about why Todd Matshikiza has been neglected in South African jazz studies and by South African jazz educators. Because the ignoring of Todd Matshikiza is but a symptom of the general neglect of South African jazz in the broader teaching of jazz in South Africa. Mm-hmm. We cannot just honor Todd without recognizing that South African jazz has become something to reckon with recently via the talks about transforming the curriculum, via the talks of decolonization, and via the, again, slow-paced recognition that jazz cannot be used as an alibi. American jazz cannot be used as an alibi for the teaching of musics from Africa, including urban musics, which include South African jazz. When I first encountered Todd Matshikiza, it was through my literary classes when we were studying South African literatures via discussing Drum Magazine. I did not discover Todd Matshikiza via my being taught in a South African music department. And so I think, as Sazi has just said, us discussing Todd is also a way of discussing ourselves. So as much as this is a celebration, it is also a moment for us reckoning with where South African jazz is, how it engages and articulates with other political processes that have to do with higher education in this country. Thank you.
Okay, no, you are welcome. Thank you very much. So on that note, Dr. Dalamba, you are basically arguing that there hasn't been much in terms of responsibility, taking responsibility as a nation, as a country, and particularly in those institutions of learning where music is taught, to highlight and to actually expose the works and the legacy of this wonderful man to the next generations of students. Is that the sense? Is that the sense that yes?
It is that sense, but it's also, it talks much more broadly to how we teach music, what we think we're teaching when we're teaching music. Are we teaching scales? Are we teaching ways of knowing? And like new epistemic paradigms that South African jazz can actually contribute to quite broadly. I'm saying that in the rush to teach jazz in South Africa, if you can call it a rush, in the rush to mainstream jazz education, shall we say, there's been a quite lazy appropriation of those jazz musicians who most approximate the American soundscape. And so, for example, you will find that people are very happy to be teaching Bekim Seleku, very happy to be teaching Chris McGregor, but in the same breath, will ignore Tete Mbambisa. And with this ultimate irony that, of course, Tete Mbambisa was a huge inspiration to Chris McGregor. So I'm saying that part of that lack of responsibility, part of that lack of accountability may be explained by the rush to approximate the American jazz soundscape. And this is an old thing in South African jazz musicology. People like Carol have written about this. Chris Ballantyne has written about this in terms of the looking to the USA paradigm in South African jazz history. And what I'm saying is that our discussion of Todd Matshikiza today could help us by concentrating on one person to actually unpack and tease out these really regressive and conservative tendencies in South African jazz education at large.
Okay, thank you. Nomfundo, what will be your experience in this regard, both as a student and as a lecturer? Do you feel in your experience as a student, firstly, you perhaps feel that you should have been exposed to the education, the music of Todd Matshikiza?
Yes, absolutely.
Or do you feel deprived? Do you feel that you are deprived?
I think deprived is a strong word, because I think for me, you know, I understood quite sort of in my third, fourth year of my undergrad. I started, you know, I reckoned with the fact that if I was to learn about Black artists and Black art, I needed to search outside of the university. And maybe that's because the people who were teaching me and were lecturing me at the time did not have any clue, right? And were not teaching that. And so I had to kind of sit and think, am I going to sit here and kind of wait for this information to come into the space, or am I going to find this information outside of the university? And so I did. But looking back, you know, I think, okay, I have this conflict in my mind, and I think this should have been in the curriculum when I was doing undergrad. You know, this should have been. But then I've got to also ask myself whose responsibility it was to put that necessarily slap bang in the middle of the curriculum. When I think about UCT specifically, because I think each institution is different, and the lecturers who were at UCT when I came in, a lot of them had graduated from, you know, had degrees from abroad, Berkeley, North Texas, and so forth. And so, you know, and we basically sponged. We were so grateful to be at music school at UCT that we didn't actually even question that. Why do we only have 1 or 2 lectures on South African jazz? You know, we were so caught up in learning about swing and bebop and, you know, Dixieland, you know, which when I look back, I think it's really not that, it wasn't really that important, right? But I think now as an educator sort of coming into the space, you know, I've got to think differently. I've got to say, okay, well, how is it that I can bring this kind of material into academia, but also understanding and recognizing that there are restrictions in terms of how we put this kind of curriculum into the space. And so I think it's a structural thing as well, because we want to teach South African music, we want to teach South African jazz, but the lens through which we teach it, it's still very Eurocentric, it's still very westernized. And Dr. Dalamba is very correct in saying, you know, maybe the academy is yet to have a conversation and grapple with the notion of new epistemologies. How are we teaching? What is important? You know, so I by no means have an answer, but I do have a greater awareness now, you know, than I did before. And so yeah, so that's where I'm at the moment.
And of course, we perhaps we'll talk about legacy at a later stage, but you have studied a lot of Mira Makeba's music, and you've also recorded that. And she's one of the people, to use the word beneficiary, she's one of those who have benefited from the music of Todd Matshikiza, particularly through King Kong. Your comments on that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, You know, for me, yes, I studied Miriam Makeba quite intensely, and I'm writing about her still now, 10 years after my dissertation on her. And I think, you know, again, when I come across Todd Matshikiza's name, you know, it's in passing, you know, because we've made King Kong the big thing, and we actually don't look at who created King Kong. You know, do we assign the intellectual contribution of King Kong correctly? You know,
Yes.
and so that's what I'm grappling with. I'm saying it was this incredible production, but there was a person behind it. And as Dr. Muller was saying, you know, has he been adequately recognized for that? You know, both inside and outside, you know, the education spaces. And my general sense is that absolutely not. You know, absolutely not.
Dr. Muller, your impressions about Todd Matshikiza, I mean, obviously you are such a multifaceted and complex character, multi-talented, definitely. But most of us will know him as a composer. And as she has already indicated, particularly her works in King Kong. What is your take on his role and what he has left behind as a composer?
Okay, so I want to come to the thing of the curriculum a little bit in a bit, but
Sure.
to me, the first thing to say is what I did in preparing here is I read the King Kong book, you know, with the little preface at the beginning, written by Harry Bloom. And what strikes me the whole way through this narrative, as it's been written up, as I've been able to read it, of course, in the English language, and I haven't had access to all the newspaper, I haven't gone that far, is that it is still very much, I kept asking myself as I read all about the production of this jazz opera, where was Todd Matshikiza? Where do we hear? He's not in that narrative at all, except that he was the person who quote wrote the music. But then there were people who did the arrangements. Then I found a little piece, I think it was the New Statesman, where Todd Matshikiza, you get the feeling that his voice was not present in the production of the jazz opera at all. I might be wrong, I've just read a few things, but that it's like he wrote the music and then people took over the production, and that's where it became a very much a kind of really, even if there was collaboration with some of the other Black South African musicians as arrangers, as copyists. I see Hugh Masekela was a copyist. The musicality, it feels to me like the arrangement is what took the music out of Matshikiza's hands and creativity. And that, I think that's the part that I'm curious about. I would love to know more about what that experience, maybe his wife could tell us more, maybe his son could, maybe somebody who was around could tell us, because there's this piece of writing where he walks into a bar. He said, we tried so many times and we walked out so many times, and I walked into a bar and there was a police raid and blah, 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 blah. I'm not saying it was irrelevant. I'm just saying that it was so much of the time. So on the one hand, I want to say that I think we have to do a bit of digging. As to King Kong, and then actually Sazi very kindly sent me the Mkumbani, which was also written in that time by Matshikiza. What's interesting to me is just the full array of genre and style that he just freely engages with. And I think what worries me about the arrangement issue, that it was sort of taken out of his compositional hands, is that we may have lost a bit of his voice in the arrangement of things, which is what Jeff Brookman is talking about a little bit with the choral music. It's that we lose the voice that is deeply in a certain kind of musical environment that is very experimental, crossing over, taking opportunity in anything to create something that is meaningful locally. So that's where I think we have to ask more questions about the making of that music. What is the voice of Matshikiza there? And what got lost in the process? I would love to have seen in like his original manuscripts, right, or his writing, tonic solfa, and then they translated into Western notation. What gets lost in that process? I think there are a lot of questions that I certainly want to ask, and maybe others have answers. I just haven't seen them.
No, definitely. And I think that's a very important point that has been mentioned. Even Pat Williams, who worked on this project, I think she has acknowledged that in her book, King Kong, Our Notes of Time and Music, a personal memoir of South Africa's legendary musical. Dr. Sazi Dlamini, your experiences with the men at the level of, as a student and of course as an academic, what will be your input in that regard?
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Sam. To sum up the total impact or the impression that Todd has on me. Since we heard about this, I've never stopped thinking about him, about what he represents in my work, in my music, in my culture. But perhaps to hark on what Carol was responding to, there is Todd in every aspect of African musicality that one knows. You can't help but refer to him because as far as the music is called, he demonstrated some of the things that were understood by music from, he represent almost all of the things that were understood by music originally, whether it's played out in public, whether it's taught, whether it's imbibed, whether it's processed. And as far as his representation goes, with perhaps a King Kong, which I'll just maybe comment on at this stage, is that surely it does strike me that whatever input he might have had musically, it was kind of minimal, and kind of reticent. But whatever he left there was kind of, for me, represent what he would have rather have as his voice in that score. For example, the choral music that only one track of choral music in the King Kong that you hear, and it's nothing to do with the overall theme of. It talks about the people,
People, yes.
Yeah, it talks about people, about his people, and I feel that Matshikiza was important in the way that he was, he had the ability to permeate all these facets of South African culture that are closed off from each other, be it in the way we learn, in the way we interact. And I think he had a challenge for himself, that he was just probing the sensibilities thereof to the best, actually to show his humanity rather perhaps than his blackness or his otherness, that what he probed for in his doing was and what is used as a judgment was a basic humanity. And also for me, he represents some aspects of musicality that are basic to my own approach, whereby music was not just music. Music was about everyone. It was about the society, it was about community. And it wasn't about music, it was about education, it was about social building society. And their genres had very little a role to play, music as genres. It was the experience and participation in music. And I think he pretty much lived that in his music, he lived that experience, except King Kong doesn't seem to have represented the whole totality of audience that he would have wanted to address, And also, I think privately, that Todd was very well aware of what the urban kind of marab and swing things represented of society, that the ear of that society wasn't all of the ear that he was addressing. So it was just, I'm sure some of it was his own reticence that no one really will. I mean, not everyone is here. I mean, he went to Marabi, but he went to the shipping, but you know that his mother was not there. His father was not there, you know. His father, I mean, a lot of people that were him were not there, you know. Anyway, but some were there. So I think
he understood music that way in a much more broader sense.
Multidisciplinary, very multi-sensory, multidisciplinary approach to music.
Yeah.
As a probe of life itself.
And how much of him comes through in the curriculum at UKZN as a teacher? How much of it is there available for the students?
In music.
How much of Todd Matshikiza do we have in the curriculum at UKZN?
There's nothing in the curriculum per se. What I know at music is perhaps some repertoires in the archive that researchers like me have come across and delved in to work into their teaching repertoires. And but I don't know, perhaps in literature, you know, maybe in English studies, and there would be, but in music, we've hardly scratched the surface of the importance of Todd's musicality, not only for music, but for social studies, for history and politics of the land.
So this is still a challenge that Dr. Dalamba alluded to.
Big. Not only perhaps for the academia, because I would like to place
for the academia in general,
I would like to place all the responsibility of learning to the academic space, you know, for my own experience. But I would say this is a challenge for community, for leadership, for everyone, that it's a challenge to know in certain way that matter, you know. And as we can see, we cannot wait for the institution because this has to go out, you know, to the people and ask them before they can make up their own minds.
Okay. Dr. Dalamba, of course, Todd wrote the book, Chocolates for My Wife. I think it's a memoir more than anything else. Are there any plans to publish a biography, for instance?
I'm very reluctant to do. Well, no. Look, I mean, let me. I think Dr. Dlamini has said his piece. So if I may, first I must say that I want to thank, you know, in addition to the institutions you've named, Sam, I want to thank the National Research Foundation for funding my research project on Todd Matshikiza. And it's titled Beyond King Kong, which is a theme already coming up in the panel, Beyond King Kong. And it's subtitled in the most, it just marks me as a literary student, literary historical and musicological perspectives on Todd Matshikiza. And so just the name of the project just indicates the sort of the multifacetedness and the layeredness, as Nomfundo said, of this guy, and the different kinds of experts that we might have been able to pull in, literary experts like Michael Teitelstad and my collaborator, Andrea Thorpe, historical guys like Becky Peterson and the other theater people, and musicological guys like Chris Ballantyne, you know, Jeff Brookman, etc. So this could theoretically have been, you know, a huge panel that would, you know, show really hectically very different ideas about what this guy was about. The reason that I'm very reluctant to even embark on a biography is because I spent my old life, you know, when you're doing your master's and you can very confidently say, according to Derrida. Now I don't know what the hell I thought I understood of Derrida, according to nothing. But anyway, during my master's, I spent my time deconstructing and critiquing biographies that were written by others. As a result, I'm far too intellectually paralyzed to even attempt a biography of my own. And to even try and write a narrative of somebody whose life was so huge as Todd's, even though it was very short, terribly, tragically short. It's not like Mpahlele's that ranged over decades, but equally during his short life, I mean, somebody like Todd moved from Queenstown, Komani, which had its own particular microhistories, to Johannesburg, to Britain, to Zambia. And one of the aspects of his life that urgently needs to be analyzed, and which I am in the midst of doing, in case my funders are listening, is checking out what he was doing in Zambia. So rather than try and do a monograph on Todd Matshikiza, what my plan is to do is to bring out a collection of essays called Beyond King Kong, Critical Perspectives on Todd Matshikiza. I've gotten together collaborators, Andrea Thorpe for one, who specializes in what I call the literary Todd, and importantly, Andile Khumalo, Dr. Andile Khumalo, who is more than appropriate for checking out the musicological Todd, because we have managed to find Todd Matshikiza's manuscripts, scores written in pencil that are managed to get safely. Of course, after the UCT fire, we can never say anything is safe now, but at the moment, they're safely in the archive at Rhodes University. There we saw, as Carol was saying, that Matshikiza was musically bilingual. Matshikiza is the only person I know who could score jazz in tonic sulfur. He was able to actually score a triplet using those innumerable commas and colons and semicolons that tonic sulfur consists of. So we want to bring all those things in, but we want to bring them in as perspectives so that there can be a systematic study of this guy. The same kind of long-term study that is never ending that other people would bring towards Arnold van Wyk or Mozart, because Matshikiza is worthy of this intellectual labor and effort, because he is seminal, he is a giant. I think sometimes, particularly in the mainstream jazz pedagogy discourse in South Africa, we have no idea of the preciousness that we have. And so that creates an intellectual vacuum, because again, and I won't speak too long, but just to move on or to add to what Carol was saying, that lack of intellectual vacuum and concentration has led to certain kinds of discourses crowding out Matshikiza's voice. Not only did these discourses do so in terms of his music in the 50s and 60s, but now they're doing so in terms of post-apartheid South Africa. There's a particular anxiety for a certain kind of white South African to insert themselves in Todd Matshikiza's story. There's a particular anxiety that makes them feel as if they have to be there. And then we need to ask, what is it about Todd Matshikiza, the Mandela of South African jazz, that makes it that white South Africans of a particular stripe have to be part of this story, such that we need to check out why, for example, in Chocolates for My Wife, as you have said, Sam, Todd Matshikiza only first mentions King Kong in page 110.
Towards the end, definitely.
Page 110.
That's the last chapter.
Exactly. And he says the editor said, Ezekiel Dlamini, Mandlegosi Dlamini is in court. King Kong is in court. Go cover it. So the first thing about King Kong was not about the music. It was him getting a gig as a struggling journalist who not only did jazz, but did other things that were important in Drum Magazine. There's that. The other thing is, again, a particular narrative of anti-apartheid white identity tends to elevate King Kong at the expense of Mkumbane. Now, through my archival research and long-term thinking about Todd Matshikiza, in fact, Todd Matshikiza's relationship with Ellen Payton, with whom he created Mkumbane, was far more complex and at times far more collaboratory than it was with the white members of King Kong. What has happened now is that those guys who were involved in King Kong feel the need to claim it. And in their claiming, they are once again erasing Todd Matshikiza's voice. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to take up the conversation, because I'm grateful to actually talk about Todd Matshikiza to people other than my long-suffering students. But I just think these are the things that we can talk to, because there really is an overabundance of white narratives about King Kong and about Todd Matshikiza. And this is one of the reasons why I called my project Beyond King Kong. Because there is the Todd Matshikiza who played piano for the song Meadowlands. There is the Todd Matshikiza who played with the Harlem Swingsters. They swapping piano stools with Gideon Nxumalo. There is the Todd Matshikiza who had his own group in the 40s. There is the Todd Matshikiza who was friends with Eskom Pahlele. And finally, the Todd Matshikiza who was part of the New African movement, which rather than being associated with the cool and hip Matshikis, actually tended to be quite conservative and had very, very interesting and not always friendly relationships with jazz. So how Todd Matshikiza managed to negotiate his membership with the New African movement with his love for jazz is something that's worth thinking through. Thank you.
And of course, we have Sponono as well. There's very little mention of Sponono in most, whenever he's mentioned.
Yes, Sponono, of course, was written by Gideon Nxumalo. And once we think of Gideon Nxumalo, Todd Matshikiza, and Kabi Ngoma, then we get this trinity of these particular musicians during a certain time in South African jazz's golden age, who all three of them saw the virtues of so-called Western art music, choralism, and jazz. Mm-hmm. And so all three of them were friends. In fact, certain of their papers are in each other's houses to show the degree to which they were close. So when we're looking at that vibe, as Sazi said, Todd wasn't just one thing, but it's also important to make sure that these different facets of Todd articulate, because it wasn't just it wasn't a schizo vibe such that there's jazz Todd and there's classical Todd and there's choral Todd. No, these things worked together. And perhaps the godfather of all these things was Ruben Taluza. I don't know.
And I'm wondering, just before I give others a chance, I'm wondering if, because I think in his final years, especially in Zambia, he was involved in broadcasting. And Gideon Nxumalo was involved in broadcasting earlier. I'm just wondering if there was any inspiration, but I think also there was a trend, particularly amongst the drum writers, to be involved, to not just to write. They were not just scribes, but they were also broadcasters. And this is another aspect that doesn't really come through in what we read about them. The connection between jazz and broadcasting, which is what Gideon Nxumalo did. But we don't know much about what Todd Matshikiza did on the airwaves, do we?
No, we do not. And Zambia is quite politically unstable at the moment. Of course, the other drum person who went into broadcasting was Louis Ngosi. Yes. And as I've written elsewhere, Louis Ngosi's broadcasting career enabled a lot of South African jazz musicians who were in exile to actually get gigs. And of course, one culmination of that was Gugu Mrwebe's album, Kwela Songs, now properly known as Mpaqanga Songs. And certainly the other thing, so I think the broadcasting thing was part of the educational vibe. I mean, you'll remember, Sam, that Gideon Nxumalo was kicked out of the SABC because he used his broadcast to complain about the Sheffield massacre. So there was something public intellectual about these broadcasting missions that these guys undertook. So certainly that's something that one will have to look at in terms of Todd's career in Zambia, and of course his anthropological career, where he carried on and subverted some of Hugh Tracy's forays into post-South African borders musical practices. And I mean, somebody like Liz Gunner would be a wonderful foundation to start from in terms of the history of broadcast in South Africa. Yes, thank you.
Yes. Nomfundo, as a recording artist, do you think South African radio in general is doing enough, particularly to highlight the music, what I'll call heritage music? The album you did, for instance, is based on, it was inspired by the music of Mira Makeba and contemporaries like Todd Matshikiza. What is your experience in terms of what you hear on the airwaves? Are we getting enough of that music? Is it celebrated enough? And if not, why? What's the problem?
Does it even play? I mean, really, we want to talk about South African radio. I mean, that kind of constitutes an entire conference. to really unpack, how that is radio is a form of gatekeeping in South Africa, in the South African landscape. And, the radio practice, a lot of it, it's like we've inherited it from the apartheid government, this idea that, African music and South African music, plays between a certain time. It's always being kept, always being, rationed out. And so, no, that's completely appalling in terms of how much, radio is not doing anything to preserve, definitely not mainstream radio and not national sort of broadcast radio stations are doing the bare minimum, and to the point that, artists now recording this music or doing any kind of tribute type of, it's not going to enjoy airplay, because it's no longer about whether the music is good, whether the music because when we listen to music, we've got to think about music beyond how it entertains us. We've got to think about music in a sense that, how does it teach us? What does it tell us about a time when we were not alive?
How does it touch us as well?
Exactly, and I think the music that we hear on radio now is just telling us about, what's popular. It's not so much on this level of what can we learn, about a time when we were not here, and so for me as a recording artist, I've lost all hope in terms of, getting my music, played on air. I mean, and that's a former disillusionment of my youth. My first album, and one can really easily feel like, oh, my music's not good enough because this or that, and it's really not. It's just because the system and the way it's designed, it's not really designed to do much. And it actually reminds me of this this idea that songs have work to do. Songs work, and music has work to do. It's not it's not just about entertaining. Radio. No.
Today's Freedom Day in South Africa. I hear they did play some Miriam Makeba songs today. There was one.
Well, as they would, isn't it? Because we play.
Maybe they were waiting for this day. I don't know.
Yeah, we play it sometimes to mark something, and then we move along. And Dr. Dalamba said something interesting in her first sort of speech, and she said, this idea of this appropriation and approximation as well. And I find that, as South African musicians, as jazz musicians, as young jazz musicians, we also need to look at ourselves. We also need to look at ourselves and ask ourselves, why are we not writing about Todd? Why are we not reading about people like Todd? Why do we want to read and write only about the musicians that continue to be hailed, in America and so forth? So I think it goes both ways. That we also have to ask ourselves that, why is it that we find interest in certain artists and not in others, and what that says about us. Yeah.
I hear you. Dr. Carol Muller, you are based in the States. How much of African music do you hear from that side? In South Africa, we hear a lot of American music, and I think there's more of it than local music. What is your experience, and in particular, what has been your experience with the music of Todd Matshikiza? Where do you remember the first time hearing any of his compositions on radio?
Well, no. What I want to say about the States, I think, is that there's a lot of specialized radio. So if you want to hear this kind of music, you have to maybe listen to a public radio station that will have a few programs. It's not that different from South Africa, in that you're listening to the kind of the same canned stuff over and over again. What I want to suggest is that radio is maybe not where we need to look right now, but maybe it is on what can we look on the internet? Where are the podcasts? Maybe that we need to do more of this kind of educating in different kinds of ways. The thing that has really struck me is, and I just say this through the COVID era when we've all been so isolated, I think I honestly, my teaching has completely changed as I've had to teach on Zoom. but my sense is that we need to connect through sound. And that I think this is the moment for music. I really just have the sense poetry and music are somehow, I mean, of course, we had the wonderful poet Amanda Gorman at, at the inauguration of Biden. So there was a public kind of, suddenly America woke to poetry again. But it's so much more than that. I really feel like we are wanting to hear this. We're wanting to hear stories. Just, I mean, I think the US of Audible. I listen to books so much more now than I read them. I think students don't really want to read flat pages of information anymore. You can read more quickly, but there's something about the sound of the voice. I do have to tell you that I have been working very hard. But, so I'm going to take your question in a slightly different direction, which I've been working very hard to see if I can get a way to start podcasting about South African jazz. And I'm saying this as a South African, not as somebody who's wanting to take the voices of others, but really to get the narratives down there in a way that I can do. Because we can do Zoom recordings, right, at a very fundamental, basic level. And I just think that if we can start to verbalize the stories in yes, maybe 53 or 59 minute segments with a lot of people's music in them, there's another way to present this story that is more kind of orally transmitted rather than just written in books, which we, anyway, I think that's where I am now. Matshikiza, I've never heard on radio. I've never, but I actually grew up, I have to say, in my father's a Presbyterian minister. We grew up with no radio, nothing. I had a piano. We had nothing because we just had no money. I mean, I know it's hard to imagine that a white South African is that way, but it was that way for us until I went to my father and I said, I'm in music. I really need to have this. And then he bought it for me, but he was very self-conscious about having too much material possession, and we didn't have the money. I mean, we just didn't have it in our family. So I didn't grow up with that kind of thing. And so for me, I suppose I'm much more interested in the storytelling, in the narration of things. What I would love to see people is just being so excited about digging in the archive. I think that's what graduate school did for me in a fairly conservative music department. It was that thing, I was at NYU, I went into the archive and I touched Mozart's first manuscript. It was that thing of yes, it is a kind of an allure of connecting to a deep past. I mean, Mozart is not my hero, but it was that thing of, because the archive was shut when I was growing up in South Africa, right? The government shut down, news 70 years was shut off to us. So we couldn't know what had happened in the recent past because you weren't allowed to dig. When that opened up, I just remember the sheer excitement of doing it. So maybe what we want to do for our students is to kind of, I mean, I'm sure that Lindelwa and Nomfundo and Sazi are just doing a wonderful job with students to excite them about this stuff. But what it's not, it is we need to know about the present, but we also need to understand the present in terms of the past. So Matshikiza for me is just, he's kind of blown into the space for me. And I'm so grateful that Lindelwa has done the work that she's done, right, already, so that I really have some starting points myself. But there's also something I think about the pride in national musical heroes. It's not just the people who went into exile. It is, I mean, he did leave, but he also was here beforehand. And it's that kind of archive, I think, that we need to make available to people.
No, definitely. No, I agree with you there.
Because I think I've spoken to
that. No, for sure. Let me just quickly announce that we are opening the lines for the questions. The attendees can ask anything. I already have two questions. The first one is from Chatradare Devryop. I hope I'm pronouncing that properly. And the question is, can your speakers talk about what was the genius of Todd Matshikiza's musical style? I think to a certain extent that has been alluded on. Dr. Sazi Dlamini, I think you have said a mouthful about that, but you'd like to give this one to contribute to this one?
Yeah, no, that one from Chet's Professor Devru, my colleague at UKZN.
Oh.
It's a tough one regarding Todd, because he had no one style. And so his performance and his output in one other style cannot easily be attributed to another. And as it stands, there's no one complete body of his work that can be judged. If I suppose one could take his choral music approach and then in a comparative way look at what other composers, choral composers, or one could go to his, he was one of the innovators of African jazz. And there, in what I've discovered is how subtle, if one can venture to such territories of genius as a measure of a man. But it's hard to can pin him down in a sum and say, but he obviously thought hard about whatever he was going, especially if it involves music. For me, Todd has become kind of crucial in interrogating some of the ways we construct traditions, and popular music in South Africa, and how we name and appropriate, especially things like African jazz, Baqanga, Majuba jazz, Bantu jazz. I've tended to think a lot about that, through which Todd lived and practiced, and obviously had a very secure sense of them, but which are very hard to glean from what is left, either as an archival thing or through narratives or through the sounds that you hear. You really have to think about it. For example, it's very easy to think Majuba jazz is the same as Baqanga, same as township jazz or township swing, but all of those, you can talk forever to actually tease out not what they are, but what they meant, For example, when I look at Majuba jazz, I actually came out, there's a sound of Majuba jazz, and it's not entirely just Marabi, 145, 164, 51 sound. No, it's not. Just as Marabi itself is not just that. And Todd was one of the people who had to negotiate influence, be it from the States, be it from the countryside, be it from the urban kind of culture. And I'm fascinated in a way to point out that he obviously thought deep about making music and what music represented. And I just think, to answer perhaps Chet's in a very kind of feeble way, failing, is that that is an open question.
Yeah, definitely.
To all the comparison, who can measure up to Todd in whatever Todd was doing to can say, they are doing it better.
Can I jump in here, Sam, through you?
Yes, sure.
I think there's a couple of things that, when I think about Todd and I think about his contemporaries, there has been this, there's been this notion or this tendency, especially from that period of the 50s, 60s, where Black art was always mediated, right? Mediated, there always had to be a white person who's in between the Black artist and their work, always kind of saying, well, you can improve this, you can sophisticate this, let's do the arrangement like this, let's do that, that can go on. And it's the same thing, you talk about African jazz and variety, it was the same, and so, we must always be cautious not to want to jump to only emphasize what was their musical style and what, because Black artists don't have the luxury of only being looked at through their style. They need to be looked at in terms of who they were. Because historically, Black artists were not really recognized and acknowledged as people, as contributors and creators of high art, right? And so nowadays, that's why you find situations where we would rather wax lyrical about the work of Bheki Mseleku, because we can actually say, oh, well, he played dominant 7 chords and he played subdominants and he was actually able to play in these keys. And that's what we want to focus on. We want to jump into, well, he was brilliant because he could write swing, or he could, But you see, then when we focus too much on what their music was doing, we again erasing who they were. And also, secondly, the over-reliance on the archive. I mean, I attended a webinar where Dr. Tozama April said something she said, the archive is in and of itself a colonial construct, because a lot of, it was the nationalist government or the colonizers' way of erasing. People were deciding what to put into the archive. When we write, who decides what to put in? So when we write about Todd, there's someone who's deciding, this is what I want to write about Todd, and this is what I'm not going to write about Todd. This is what I'm going to write about Makeba. This is what I'm not going to write about Makeba. So we also have to be careful in terms of our over-reliance on the archive. And then thirdly, and the last point, when I look at Todd and I listen to his music as a jazz artist, and I listen to the way that jazz musicians perform and sing his repertoire, I think he's extremely brilliant because he was able to bring jazz sensibilities in an environment, right, that was very sort of vernacular and very sort of indigenous. When I listen to Miriam Makeba sing Back of the Moon, I think, well, Miriam would not be able to really exercise her jazz sensibilities had it not been for the compositional genius of Todd Matshikiza. Because he wrote melodically in a way that people could express themselves in a very African way, but in the jazz idiom. But we have to look at it, all of it. We've got to look at the man, who he was, because that informed how he wrote music and the place from which his art came from. So we cannot separate that. We cannot just look at their musical brilliance. We've got to look at them because they were people and they were important. And how we look at them now, it's on us. If we continue just to look at their work, they did this song, then we are not looking and recognizing that they were people.
No, that's true. We have to look at their circumstances as well, the historical background, the struggles they went through, what inspired their music, all of that. No, definitely agree with you. Dr. Dalamba?
Can I just say something very quickly? It'll be one, which is that but it also depends on how we think about the archive. The archive is not only what is written. The archive is also human capital, what we remember. So I think if we can open up how we think about, that's why my focus on the voice. It's not just what got put in a particular kind of place, because that we know is a very limited kind of
like memory.
Right, but we have to look at human memory too.
Memory, maybe institutional memory as well.
The archive, actually.
Dr. Dalamba, here's another question from Anonymous. He or she writes, seeing as some of Matshikiza's original scores are written in tonic solfa versus staff notation, tonic solfa, which has historically been regarded as the black other of musical notation in South Africa in both jazz and choral circles, do you think this has further allowed the South African Jazz Society to overlook Matshikiza's contribution to our history?
I think that would allow the South African Jazz Society to get away with things too easily. So, for example, particularly with Umkumbane, because when Todd was away from the hustle and bustle of Johannesburg and was able to work with the guys in Kumbane, Kato Mana, et cetera, and it was such a choral heavy work that using tonic solfa in that instance made sense. But he always translated the stuff to staff notation. Indeed, some of the stuff is professionally printed. There are sheets of music of various King Kong tunes when King Kong was being shown in London that come song by song, the old sort of sheet music that used to happen in the early 20th century. So it's certainly not because things were in tonic solfa. And indeed, people must do the work then, because I tell you, if they wanted to perform that music, if they wanted to interpret that music, they would bloody well then turn it into staff notation, right? Mm-hmm. The other thing is, I mean, as Grant Aldridge, and it's one of those weird South African things, Grant Aldridge was my lecturer at Rhodes, but now he's my colleague at Wits. And as I always tell the students, what this means is that Grant is not as young as he looks, and I'm not as old as I look, because they always wonder how it is that somebody was my teacher is now my colleague. Grant wrote beautiful work on a history of tonic solfa in South Africa. And of course, before it was a black other type of scribing, it was a class differentiation as seen in Victorian Britain. about who was supposed to have access to the music and how they were expected to access it. And of course, that also points to how a lot of that music was choral music, to do with voice rather than accompaniment, etc. But that's just by the by. So I don't think it's because Todd wrote some of his stuff in tonic sulfur, because firstly, because it did, the stuff was translated into staff notation. And secondly, the guys, the South African Jazz Society did not, there was lack of intellectual will, shall we say. And we can't just blame the political circumstances at the time, because other things were sorted out in terms of South African music, but not jazz. And so just to add to that, in my what Nomfundo is saying, I'm a very old-fashioned kind of historian. I was nurtured by the likes of Jeff Guy and Paul Malem, etc., etc. So when she said this about the archive, I could feel Jeff Guy's ancestral spirits saying, "What is she saying? What is she saying?" But you're absolutely correct in terms of we can't just look at the archive, but it's also about the imagination that we take to the archive. There's some kind of weird thing that people think just because Back of the Moon was performed in a particular way, that's the only way we can perform it. And for that, just for the audience, the lovely audience that we've managed to retain, let's just remember what Louis Moholo, for example, did with Todd Matshikiza's wedding hymn. Let's remember what Abdullah Ibrahim did in his album Blues for a Hip King with Todd Matshikiza's music. Let's remember that these guys like imbued Todd Matshikiza's music with a different significance, as if it was somehow foundational to their lives in exile, because he was there before them, he arrived there before them. And so as they constructed different narratives to make sense of their lives as South Africa, Todd and King Kong gathered very different kinds of significances and emotional gravitas. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say about that. But certainly, I do think that the archival thing is important. I wrote down before we started Bekizizwe Peterson's chapter, The Archives and the Political Imaginary. The opening paragraph there contains two very important points, where he talks about the archive as the ordering of the past as inheritance, and then with the aim of transforming inheritance into deliverance. And I think as we talk about Todd Matshikiza today and think about studying him systematically, not just in J, which at times does require a trip to the archive, is about ordering. What is the function of the historian, as Hayden White would say? Ordering the past as inheritance. And then how do we transform that ordering into deliverance? So to agree with Nomfundo, it's not enough just to build a building, to erect a building and stuff it with like remnants of so-called Black history, because what if it burns down? Yeah, as we saw it happening. What do we do with these erected structures that contain all of these things? Because depending on what we did with the African Studies collection throughout the time that we had it after the end of apartheid, depending on what we did with it since then, will determine how much we can salvage from inwards, as Carol says. So it's something that's not just reliant on the building, because still we do not necessarily always require the physical catalog and the building to order our past as inheritance. So what we do with the things that we have is terribly important, because that is what will give us deliverance in this, not in a religious way, but in a sense of, you know, once we have ordered this thing as inheritance, how then can we challenge mainstream South African jazz studies and say, we too lived. These sonic worlds did have meaning. And Todd Matshikiza was but one person in the stream. Thank you.
And sometime in the early 50s, let's say around 1950, he did establish a private school, the Todd Matshikiza School of Music. How much information do we get from the archives with regard to this school?
There is what remains, which is obviously no indication. I'm very touched to see, actually, if I may, that Marian Matshikiza is here as a member in this audience, because she was very kind to me when I was starting off this thing. And I remember she couldn't believe that I was a Dr. Dalamba when she heard that Dr. Dalamba was coming. She didn't expect a little person running around lost in Cape Town. So I'm very glad to see that she's here. So I can only say that from the generosity of the Matshikiza family, what we know about the Todd Matshikiza School of Music is very, very little. I saw in the papers an advert for the thing, but because we're always dealing with scraps and slivers when we're talking about Black history, it's always scraps and slivers. It's always like, unless you're likely to know more. All I can really say about that moment is that he wasn't the only one starting a music school at the time. At the time, yeah. I mean, there was Griffiths Motsielwa. There were all sorts of guys starting.
And you've mentioned, you have also mentioned Professor Mgoma earlier.
Yes, indeed. And of course, that was part of the
You mentioned Professor
African
Mgoma
artists.
earlier, for instance.
Yes. And it was before Dorke House. Perhaps there was some kind of relationship with the Bantu Men's Social Center, but what is for me significant is that these guys who were all products of mission school colleges wanted to give back and to take the power of like educational hegemony away from just the mission schools. To me, that's the important thing. In the absence of knowing anything more. That doesn't mean we must try and know anything more, but we can certainly guess from what people like Kabi did in alliance with in alliance with people like Walter Nhlapo, because there was a push towards independence. As Nomfundo was saying, this was very difficult to talk about and to actually attain, because there was always some white mediatory presence. So people like Mphahlele, Syndicate for African Artists, people like Todd, people like Griffiths Motsielwa, Peter Ress, and et cetera, were trying to hook all this up. And just to end my segment here, because I'm liable to talk too much, what Nomfundo was saying about the Black artists always having this mediatory presence, one of the most terrifying sentences that I read from Mona Glass's book on King Kong is when they discussed the making of King Kong, the finalization of King Kong's music. Mona Glass described it as a strenuous process of refinement. That to me is a chilling phrase. And it's very interesting that there isn't such a term attributed to Stanley Glasser, but indeed, again, it's this attempt at like willful insertion into the story that we did so much work into this. And in case I don't have time to talk again, may I just point out that Todd Matshikiza wrote the music that would eventually end up in King Kong way before King Kong was even imagined. So any kind of rubbish about who actually composed what and who's responsible for what is absolute nonsense. Todd Matshikiza composed that music long before King Kong was staged. Thank you.
Oh, that's a very profound point right there. And of course, as I've indicated in the introduction, he was a very multifaceted character, definitely a genius. We will need more time to talk about Todd the teacher, Todd the journalist, Todd the pianist, and Todd the father, of course, and Todd the loving husband who wrote chocolates for my wife. But I'm really happy that we have had this one. For me, it was such a great eye-opener. It was a journey of discovery. I've learned so much. And then in closing, I would like to ask every panelist to just make some closing remarks. I'll start with who? Nomfundo?
Thank you for that, Sam. And perhaps as I close, just to clarify, so that no one gets no one walks away feeling like, I'm saying, the archive is colonial. The context of that really was in this idea that pre-colonization, Black people, there was no sort of population registration. That was the context under which that came. And I think also, having, for me, this was really very enlightening. And I think about when we speak about Todd Matshikiza, we speak about the era, we speak about these Black artists, we speak about the curriculum, and we speak about the archive. I worry still because when I read, and when I was reading as a student doing masters, what I would find in books, it left much to be desired. And even now, when I read, I'm writing on Miriam, and a colleague sent an article that's published in a journal about Miriam, completely riddled with errors. And so we must guard against what is in the archive. And also, I think as we write and as we document, we must remember that there's a language issue as well, because I find that when I read papers and I read, it's elitism a lot of the time. I find the writing, and the documentation of history as it sits right now, that there's a barrier, there's a language barrier. So we must expand how we write and how we document, so that we don't really, it doesn't become something for us to converse about as people who can speak this language. But how is it that we can speak about this in a way that people who don't have, good English or can access it? So thank you very much, and I hope that we will continue this discussion another time, but it's certainly been very enlightening for me.
Okay, great. Dr. Carol Muller?
Well, for me too, this is
closing remarks, ma'am.
Yeah, this has been really just an amazing beginning is really how I see it. So a few things that I have been thinking about with just thinking through Todd Matshikiza, maybe not just, with King Kong as well. One of them is the idea of the composer, right, as African, which was not, I heard Bongani and Dodana Breen talking about the notion of African art music, and the very, it's a very complex and problematic moment for any sense of an African composer in terms of white South Africa. And what it really amazes me is the way in which Todd Matshikiza just wrote. Do you know what I mean? It was, he defiantly wrote. He composed the music, even if it didn't always come out in the way that he originally intended it. The point is he did it, and he listened to the voices of people around him. I'm so struck again by this era in township life when people say people sang about everything. So it was this sense of the human voice telling its own story. I don't know, there's something new way in which I'm starting to think about voice in this moment, not just that the kind of way in which ethnomusicologists have said music is important in everyday life in Africa. That's not what we're saying here. There's something about the harnessing of the singing voice to tell your story, and Todd Matshikiza is doing that in the most amazing way. It's not just the voice, of course, there's all the arrangement, all the other music that goes with it, but it is the power of the voice, the power of everybody's story to be included, and that's what he does with genre as we see it. He just takes what is there and just makes something amazing out of it. So it's
he did it with genre, but also in a genuine way.
Yes, and it is, as Sazi says, it's tied to the humanity of what was around him. That's what he was. That was his music making was the making of song in the way it was around him all the time. But I think that we have to think of what we then mean by what is the composer, really. It's so dull when we look at what else is happening elsewhere, right? It becomes so limited. And he's so expansive and so big.
I agree with you.
I do want to come back to the notion of language and the notion of mother tongue, which became
briefly, we're just wrapping up.
I'm just going to lay out the issue of mother tongue, and then the last thing that intrigued me about King Kong, and I don't know how much Todd Matshikiza had the say in this, but as an undergraduate a very long time ago at UKZN, I learned to gumboot dance, and at the time it was trying to get a sense of what was the history of gumboot dancing, and to see it there in King Kong as a kind of a very much a feature of the landscape. It became so contested in the 1980s in some way in which people didn't feel it was authentically, maybe it was just white people who didn't feel it. I mean, it's just so wonderful. And then to see it reiterated over and over again, to kind of create a historical space for gumboot dancing is for me just personally important. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Dlamini, closing remarks, briefly.
Thank you. Aside of the privilege of sharing and listening to colleagues, saying such profound and provocative things about jazz, I'm inclined to maybe to emphasize, the challenges that Todd Matshikiza's career places in front of a jazz studentship, especially of South African students, and that there's perhaps efforts, much as we put as we do to play music, that we are challenged much more to engage more profoundly with the subjects that the notes, the styles, and really to go beyond the individuality of it, to maybe to see music as being central in relationships, to ourselves, to society, and to structure in ways that can open us up and maybe unite us in challenging the ways that culture sits on us. For example, Todd was very responsive to the jazz influence from the beginning. And he was the one who carved out, what today we start to call African jazz explicitly, when he was among the first musicians to denounce the influences of even American jazz,
Mm-hmm.
that was taking away, our voices, to want to sound like the blues piano, and that the people were forgetting their origins, modernity in Marabi, in the shantytown, in the sounds of the shantytown. And that's how Machuba came about.
Mm-hmm.
He was answering to this, elision, of this, the hybridity that comes out of really from below, very much below, And perhaps that's what I would read. And also maybe to say one thing about the archive, that it is crucial now, that our studentship involves an engagement. The South African Music Archive is a vast one. It's a vast one, and also in seeing how much we try to relate most honestly to the roots, as we want to delve into the roots, to what that the archive, engagement in the archive might well prove to be very beneficial in talking to these conditions, to our conditions, and also just to round ourselves and be challenged by the kind of scholarship centered in jazz that Todd Matshikiza was representing.
Okay, great stuff. Thank you, great stuff. Dr. Dalamba, in 2 minutes, how can we best preserve this rich and proud legacy as a nation and as a people?
We do it through work. There is no shortcut. But we do it, I would hope, with a particular kind of spirit, because this is not about identity politics. Through my forays in the archive and checking out stuff on Todd Matshikiza, I found that he made mention of the Rainbow Nation, and this was in the 1950s. I'm not talking about a facile and now recently unpopular notion of the Rainbow Nation, but I think it is somewhat significant that somebody at that time who had to live in the conditions in which he lived, could speak about the Rainbow Nation. This was around the time that he was composing Uxolo, the composition for the Johannesburg birthday celebrations. And he said, okay, yeah, it hasn't been an easy past. We've dug the gold, you've got everything else. Can we get on with it now and build something? And I think as fires raged, both physical and emotional, as psychological impacts to do with COVID-19, as we find ourselves as music scholars and art scholars being continuously marginalized in the era of austerity, I think people and characters and figures like Todd Matshikiza are extremely important to remind us that art was able to thrive in even less salubrious circumstances. And so I think it is through work and through tuning out all the noise in order to hear the music, essentially, that we might actually get things done in a more effective way in this country. Thank you.
Oh, great stuff. I think that's a wonderful note to leave it there. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to my panelists and to everybody who attended. Really appreciated that. That's a great time.
Thank you.
Enjoy your day.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Happy Freedom Day.